Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May 12th installment of ARC's weekly webinars. My name is Marian Liu. I work in the Community Partnerships Group, and I will be your moderator. Today, we will be speaking with a great panel of leaders throughout the region on inclusive community engagement during the COVID-19 crisis and beyond. If you've joined us previously in this webinar series, you've heard from my colleagues here at the ARC and at Neighborhood Nexus about how the crisis has exposed and accelerated existing inequalities by race and class. You've heard, for example, that where race and ethnicity are known, the percentage of African American cases and deaths in Georgia due to COVID-19 is well at over 50% of all cases and deaths, which is vastly disproportionate to their percentage of the general population at around 30%. With respect to the economic impact of COVID-19, the ARC and Neighborhood Nexus published a blog post just out today with their findings that in the 10-county metro Atlanta region, 50% of Hispanic wage earners are employed in the most vulnerable occupations, far more than workers of other ethnicities. And with low-income people of color being predominantly renters, housing precarity will likely only get worse. When it comes to federal relief funding for small businesses, it's been estimated that businesses owned by people of color may be severely disadvantaged in receiving Paycheck Protection Program PPP loans. And finally, even though it's Asian American Heritage Month, given the ongoing racialized framing of the virus by our leaders, we're also seeing an uptick in anti-Asian racism and xenophobia. None of these statistics are especially surprising, unfortunately, nor are these disparities new. So the question for today's conversation is how can we generally, but especially now during COVID-19 response and recovery, center the margins when we must be physically apart? Can we center the lived experiences and stories of communities of color and immigrant communities in our public outreach, even while our communities may be or are in survival mode? And to help us think through these questions, we're very lucky today to be joined by three leaders at their respective organizations in their respective fields, which are intentionally diverse, not just with respect to planning. They're not just in city planning, city and regional planning, and their work revolves around public engagement. We do have one change in our lineup. Stephanie Cho, the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta, will be filling in for Swati Shanmugasundaram. So thank you, Stephanie. I'd like to start by asking each of our guests to briefly introduce yourself, your work, and if you're inclined, to share what sustains you in this particular moment and what is giving you life in this work. Odetta, can you begin, and then we'll move to Stephanie and end with Kalinda.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marian, for this opportunity and for including me on the panel. My name is Odetta McLeish-White. I'm the Managing Director for the Transformation Alliance here in Atlanta. And I would have to say that my family and the laughter that they bring me are sustaining me in this particular time.
Stephanie.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Cho. I'm the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. And I would say the thing that is sustaining me right now is my child is watching Wildcrats, so I really am appreciating public broadcasting stations and teachers right now for the very creative lesson planning that's happening right now.
Thank you. And Kalinda?
Hi, so I'm Kalinda Lee. I serve as the Vice President for Historical Interpretation and Community Partnerships at the Atlanta History Center. And, you know, there are two things I think that are really sustaining me. Certainly that my family is together and well is something that we have been really appreciative of in a way that we often overlook. And I'm also really being sustained by the way that we are inventing ways to deal with this crisis and ways to reach out to community that we thought were going to take us years, and that we are, you know, in weeks figuring out the technology, figuring out how to get into people's homes and conversations in new ways. So that's exciting to me.
Thank you. Thank you so much to each of you. You are definitely inspirations to me. So Before we move into our presentations, I'm going to ask Jared Lombard here at the ARC, who's working behind the scenes with us, and he's going to review the logistics for how all of you can participate in today's conversation.
Thank you, Marion. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right-hand corner. Currently, you're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would like to prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity today to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time during today's presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentations, and also a select few after each presentation. You also may see chat messages from us in that window. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Marion.
Great, thank you, Jared. So now we'll move into the presentations part of our program, and I'm going to turn over the screen to Odetta. Or Jared, can you do that?
Yeah.
Thank you. And if you have any questions or comments while she's speaking, again, please be sure to enter your question through your questions pane, and we'll share at least one for her to respond to after the presentation. So, thank you, Odetta.
And make sure I'm unmuted. Very good. Okay, thank you all so much for this opportunity. The Transformation Alliance is a collaborative that has been working in Atlanta for over 5 years now on the intersection of race and transit. You see our tagline there, strengthening communities through transit. We were created in response to the launch of MARTA's Transit-Oriented Development Program, and also to the lessons we were observing about the Atlanta Beltline and how its development was really displacing and changing the literal complexion of our city. As an organization of over 30 members encompassing voluntaries for affordable housing finance, nonprofits, businesses, and the transit system, we really had to come up with some guiding principles, and we have two kind of North Stars is what I call them. We are leading with racial equity, we are focused on transit, and the Transformation Alliance envisions an Atlanta where a person's racial identity no longer predicts their success and opportunity in life, and where communities are strengthened by transit and not displaced by it. In order to achieve equitable transit-oriented development that's informed and led by racial equity, we recognize there are multiple issues that you have to be prepared to consider. And so we have this kind of issue wheel that you see before you. We have partners that represent each of these issues, and we have members who are considered issue champions that work closely with me to help our response and our thinking to include all of the topics that you see here. I wanted to offer just a little bit of a few slides discussing this idea of citizen participation or community engagement. And we've actually been talking about this for decades. Some folks watching may be familiar with Sherry Arnstein's ladder of citizen participation, which she actually developed in 1969. You can see the citation there. And she represented this ladder with rungs that go all the way from non-participation to citizen power. And as you can see, different types of ways to discuss decision-making represent tokenism or citizen power or non-participation. Her ladder was then used in 1992 by Roger A. Hart, who's described as a child rights academic. In 1992, he used Arnstein's ladder to create another one to explore how we can engage young people in community decision-making. And you'll see his is also holding on to her sort of 8 rungs, and you have non-participation versus participation. So we have these frames of trying to think about how we can really consider our impact and outreach. And then we move from ladders to this spectrum, which was developed in 2014 by the International Association of Public Participation. I found this to be an interesting spectrum because on the bottom there, you'll see that there's a promise that you're making to the public, and at the top, there's the public participation goal. And rather than framing any one of these choices as bad or not bad, it really depends on what is your goal. If you're seeking to inform, then you have a commensurate promise to the public to keep them informed. Consultation is to keep people informed, to listen and acknowledge concerns, etc. And you do move along the spectrum to a greater level of power and engagement with the community, where ultimately we are asking the final decision making to be in the hands of the public, and you are promising to implement that decision. I wanted to share just a few of the ways that Transformation Alliance members have been connecting with the community under our work. We have done town halls on transit issues. We have done leadership academies for both adults and for youth. We have developed economic development programs like Atlanta Crew, which focuses on infrastructure, green infrastructure installment and workforce development. We've helped to influence the programming decisions of innovative programs like Station Soccer. And we have used arts and culture to create beautiful murals at transit that also reflect deep conversations with residents. And what made these efforts feel very different and special at the time was their reliance on deep face-to-face connections between people. So what do you do when you can no longer get face-to-face with people, or at least not in the numbers that used to make us feel we were really making a connection and perhaps hearing from a certain volume of residents? We do know technology still won't solve the problem, but it can be a start. The NPU standing for Neighborhood Planning Unit, it is a system for Atlanta of grouping neighborhoods throughout the city. And it's a way for them to communicate with city government. So the NPUS have created a resident meeting guidebook that really leans into not only how to use technology and platforms for webinars and video conferencing, but how to incorporate the use of the telephone for those who are not able to get online. City Council has been using voicemail for public comment. Several city council persons and others have been using televised town halls and online surveys. But technology cannot replace certain things, and there are still clear barriers to its use. Phone lines, you still need them. We've got to have them. The digital divide has also been further revealed, the depth of it, and how it is keeping people from either engaging in decision making or continuing with education. There are language barriers that still have to be considered. And of course, technology cannot replace the essential currency of community engagement, which is trust. The Safe Routes to School Partnership has 3 themes that they offer for community engagement in COVID-19 world. And the first is to frame engagement not as a checkbox, but as an essential part of the process. If you have to change your timelines, if you have to change your budget in order to do community engagement better, do so in this world. Don't just check it off and say we couldn't do it, so we're going to skip that part. Think about bridging the digital divide, telephone options, language translation services, and maybe the trusted lines of communication, such as church, a civic organization, restaurants, those other sort of cultural aspects of a community. Think about using those as ways to reach people and meet people where they are. So help communities build technical and community advocacy skills so they can organize themselves. Help to sustain mutual aid networks right now, which are building skills, and make sure that people are educated about planning processes so they can participate. Coming up on the end here, I wanted to share a very interesting organizing model that comes out of Memphis, Tennessee, the Center for Transforming Communities. Rather than thinking about ladders, maybe we can think more about this kind of pyramid that leads up to collective transformation, place-based community organizing, asset-based community development, network organizing, restorative organizing. How do you invest in people and build them up towards the power that they need to ask for and demand collective transformation of their communities and their and their environments. This is, I think, a wonderful evolution or perhaps innovation to what we've been thinking of as linear and sort of this ladder concept. This builds and sort of aims towards this idea that we can work together to help people express what they want. And that's it for me. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. There's my email. And I look forward to now taking lots of notes from my other panel members. I can't wait to hear what they have to add. Thank you.
Okay, I have to unmute myself as well, and I just disappeared. Sorry. Okay, if you can hear me and see me now. I'm looking for a question, which comes from Sam Shinbaga of the ARC. How has Transformation Alliance measured success with these engagement techniques as opposed to quote unquote typical engagement techniques that were used?
Sometimes engagement techniques are measured by how many people they reach and the number of people they reach, and I think there's some value in that. We also try to gauge our success by just the experience of the people involved. So if folks do feel empowered, you can ask some of these questions on surveys, but how do people feel afterwards? Do they feel more informed? Do they feel more empowered to do things? Do they feel inspired? Have they made connections between themselves as members of a cohort or an academy? How will they take that into their own work? I do think that's one of the greatest challenges is once they depart with your sort of little certificate, how can you continue to foster that sense of connection among them and see if they have chosen to take that work into their own lives and organize around an issue or a topic. There's a lot of personal agency that is involved, and we can give them information and help to foster connection, and it will ultimately be upon them to decide what issue they want to pursue. So you can do some surveying for sure, but I would encourage a blend of the quantitative, how many people are doing this, with the qualitative.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. And in preparing for this webinar, I was reading on community engagement elsewhere, and one woman mentioned using lived experience as a data point, which I thought was really interesting. And I think that's something that I will continuing to be thinking of as this progresses. So next we'll be moving to Stephanie Cho. And again, Stephanie was a last minute, she's filling in last minute, so this is a great opportunity. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Odetta, the best. So I loved the pyramid. It was so great. And especially around the in-language work and just some of the barriers, because that's definitely some things that we're facing in our community as well. Again, I'm Stephanie Cho. I'm the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Atlanta. And we have chapters in 5 other areas, including Atlanta. And our mission is to protect and promote the civil and human rights of Asian Americans in Georgia and the Southeast through our policy advocacy work, our low-cost legal services, organizing and civic engagement, and impact litigation. And our vision is to create a social movement in which communities of color are fully empowered, active in civic life, and working together to promote equity, fair treatment, and self-determination for all. And so to talk a little bit about how our organization has pivoted in this moment of doing massive outreach. As an organization, we used to do tons of canvassing, and we were at every ethnic festival, we were out and about. So personal contact was something that we were really proud of as an organization. We're still doing that. So the spirit of that is still alive, but the way and mechanism that we do it is obviously very different. And what we've decided to do is to combine mutual aid for seniors and immune compromised individuals with our census and voting materials. So we're still doing the in-language work and getting that information out to people who are not looking at Facebook or Instagram, but to seniors and folks that are not able to get out as much. We're also doing little mutual aid bags that are culturally specific, meaning that we're also including specific ethnic foods that seniors particularly have requested. We're doing that in combination with our text and calls that have really changed. Hold on just 1 second, okay, baby? Okay, just hold on, sorry. My kid needs something really fast. Hold on, what do you need?
This is the webinar of Badass Moms.
what do you need? Huh?
I'm hungry.
Okay, I'll get you a snack in 5 minutes. Okay.
I sent mine downstairs.
Me too. Send
Where's
one
my
my
juice
way.
box?
I'll give everyone a snack in 5 minutes. Okay. So yeah. Okay, just all right. Just finish. Anyway, I'm serious about wildcrats. It's a godsend. And so we've so far done 4,000 calls and 4,500 text messages in language to individuals around the dates that have changed around voting, the dates that have changed continuously around census. And in addition to that, we're also protecting the rights of particularly Asian Americans and immigrants in Georgia and the Southeast. We have filed habeas petitions on behalf of individuals in detention centers who are also medically vulnerable as well, including 2 trans individuals who also are HIV positive. In addition to that, we have been at the forefront of voting rights work, where immigration rights and voting rights really intersect with our work. And so we've been on the lawsuits regarding exact match in 2016 and then also in 2018. We're also working on a case around around the ballots in Spanish for Gwinnett. And so we're working on that for absentee. And then I think the thing that really changed in 2018 around the runoffs, which will definitely impact folks this upcoming year, is the right to have an interpreter of your choice at the polls. We found in 2018 that there was massive amounts of misinformation, particularly with poll workers and just inside the community about who can actually interpret for you. And in Georgia, just as a reminder, ballots are not in any Asian language printed. And I think just really quickly, I would say that to really raise up the importance of Asian American Heritage Month this month, it is a time of celebration, but it's also a time of understanding and reminding us about our history and our culture. And as the attacks on AAPIs continue, and with even also the issues around Black lives, it's no surprise that anti-immigrant sentiment is so deeply tied to anti-immigrant and general anti-immigrant sentiment and anti-Black sentiment. And the racist rhetoric and scapegoating is nothing new, and it's just a tool of white supremacy that we've seen over and over again. And I think just as Asian Americans in this time, it's really, really important to not forget our history and to continue to fight alongside immigrant and Black brothers and sisters in our fight for self-determination. Because right now, I think people are nervous, they're scared. People, even if they haven't had an experience, an attack, they are worried that that is going to happen when they start going out and about more. And the things that we've been hearing from seniors specifically, and this is why we're doing sort of wellness checks and also the mutual aid, is they're scared to just go to the grocery store right now. Maybe nothing has happened to them, but they are worried that something is going to happen to them. And so for us as an organization, the thing that hasn't changed is that we are diligent and still trying to get out in the community accurate information in language as timely as possible so that people have the right information so that they can make the decisions that really impact their lives and still stay civically engaged during this really crisis time. And I would say the last thing that cities can do to support the work that different organizations are doing is, one, to advocate for the end of 287G, which is the coupling of ICE with the Sheriff's Department, particularly in Gwinnett, in a time period right now when people are trying to do the best they can. It is not helpful to have law enforcement partner with ICE when people are just trying to get their groceries and do their daily things just to survive. partner with groups, actually with We Love You High, right, Marian?
I am
there's
holding it down for ARC now. But yes,
right,
We Love You High is a great group.
And they helped usher in with a bunch of other community groups testing on Buford Highway with the city of Brookhaven, which is a great response. Another one is to partner with census outreach and distribution of mutual aid kits, and to do that work in language. The one, I would say, thing to not do in a partnership is to not for the government to ask or cities to ask organizations that have the trust and sort of language capabilities in the community to translate documents for them because that work is real work, and people should deserve to be paid for that. And our hope is that the government, and particularly the state of Georgia, does more work on translation so that Georgia can actually be a more welcoming state for immigrants here and the ones that are to come.
So all of you who are watching, we need you to send in your questions while our presenters are speaking, because the questions are all coming from Sam. So, but I did wanted to respond to what Stephanie was saying and just say, wow, I think it's so impressive. And I'm really grateful that you are here with us today, because I think it's incredibly impressive how you've been able to pivot from doing work that, as you mentioned, was incredibly in person, was so focused on being with people at community events and in community spaces, and really, canvassing. It's all face-to-face, person-to-person contact. And the way that you've been able to incorporate your continued outreach with your communities has been incredible to see, especially that you've connected it with mutual aid efforts. So I wanted to say kudos to you, and it's really impressive to see how you've pivoted and managed this crisis from your living room with Nardi watching Wildcrats. So it's awesome. But I do have one question again from Sam. So again, please submit your questions. Question is, are there some things unique to the experiences in Atlanta as opposed to your affiliates in other parts of the country? Oh, we do have some questions coming in. Great.
Did you want me to answer that? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the difference is being in the great state of Georgia, I think is very different. And being in the South, when you look at Asian American history, the migration waves, they're a lot older. On the West Coast and on the East Coast. In the South, they're newer. And so when we think about the strides that immigrants have made in some other areas, we just aren't there at this point in time, I think. We're starting to come of age for Asian Americans, and particularly also the Latinx community here in Georgia, and people are starting to recognize that there's a substantial immigrant population here. But I think with the recent sort of rhetoric that has been really swelling up, I think, and the scapegoating, I think that it is definitely going to agitate folks to a greater cause, which I think in some ways is really going to be a different show of force in the election coming up. I think it's also going to be a different, sort of different in the way that people are going to be looking at immigrants moving forward in Georgia. And I think like immigration law is also on the table. DACA's decision is supposed to be, I think, on Thursday. I mean, there's so many things at play right now. And I think now there's real opportunities. The other thing that's very specific to Georgia is the voter suppression issues and how they manifest themselves in communities of color, specifically towards the Black vote, towards the Latinx vote, and towards the Asian vote. They are specialized racist tactics that are to each group. And it's really sophisticated and amazing how it's working in this way. It pits people against each other, and it doesn't allow people to have conversations. And then it actually really suppresses people's desires to want to fight back. And I think that is the epitome of voter suppression. So I think that's sort of the main two issues that are different.
Great. We have some other questions, but I'm going to save those toward the end. And we're going to give final presentation to Kalinda. Jared, are you able to make her the presenter? Are you?
Okay.
Okay, great.
Are we good? So again, I'm Kalinda Lee. I serve as the Vice President for Community Partnerships and Historical Interpretation at the Atlanta History Center. So I'm here representing a cultural institution, and I want to share with you a little bit about the history of that institution. I think it's a really significant consideration as we think about how we think about ownership of this space and about kind of shared citizenship within this space, shared ownership within this space. You don't necessarily have to be a US citizen, but that we are all kind of in this community together and have a stake in this community together. So the Atlanta History Center has been around for almost 100 years. And, it was, founded as this organization to arouse in the citizens and friends of Atlanta an interest in history. And what they meant specifically at that point in time in 1926, when we talked about the citizens friends of Atlanta, was this very specific kind of great man version of history and this notion of city founders, political and business leaders as being those who had a stake in the space. The shift that has come over recent years has been to really think about how ordinary people of many different backgrounds and perspectives have and can make history. And when we talk about ordinary people, we're talking about a diversity of socioeconomic realities, a diversity of genders and gender expression, a diversity, excuse me, of ethnic and national backgrounds, and to think about what that means to say who is an Atlantan, and therefore who has a stake in Atlanta's not only past, but the connection between the past and the present. In museums specifically, and I think this is common to what we call linchpin cultural institutions, the visitorship of those spaces has not necessarily been in the mainstream organizations has not necessarily been representative of the people who live in that space. And so, it's not surprising that from, the 1900s to the 1970s, almost 90% of the people who were visiting museums, and particularly history museums, were white and male. What's interesting, if you follow that forward, is even though the demographics of the society are changing, the institutions weren't changing. So when you talk about inclusivity for this institution, like a lot of cultural institutions, and I would argue a lot of other sorts of institutions too, including kind of mainstream political organizations, you're not just talking about a need to be inclusive as some kind of magnanimous or altruistic impulse. You're really talking about the very survival of these institutions, right? Like they need to be representative of the people who they are actually serving. Those are the people who are living in these communities. So what this has meant is that what we've striven toward has shifted considerably. What we have tried to avoid and deny rather than correct has been deeply situated in narratives of inequity. So for example, we can talk about a Southern past, an Atlanta past, and create a narrative around the idea that Atlanta was not significant in something like the slave trade because there weren't major plantations in this space, even though we know that when we talk about Atlanta as a rail capital, we have to think about like what was being transported on those rail lines, and certainly they were products of enslaved labor. What are being transported now through our airport through our rail lines, on our interstates, and who are the people who are laboring in that way in order to make this a prosperous community, and what ways are we acknowledging that they have a stake in this place, that we all have a stake in this place, and that their narratives need to be recorded and shared as part of our understanding of what this place is and what it can be. Because by situating people in that way, we understand that we can then acculturate people to the notion that we all need to be building together. What that has looked like for us is thinking in a very broad way about who has a stake in finding themselves and their intellectual interest represented in public discourse. So that rather than thinking about a museum as a place where we share pretty pictures and interesting artifacts, what we're really saying is, what can a museum do to help people find themselves and their intellectual histories, their stories of the past, and their intellectual interests rarely in the public discourse? That doesn't necessitate that you be educated at a certain level. It certainly doesn't necessitate that you occupy certain kinds of positions of power. Instead, we're asking questions like, who's curious? Who can use this information? Who has the right to change, to raise these questions? And how can you apply these understandings to challenge the status quo, to frame solutions, to create opportunities? So if you understand, for example, the histories of transit, public transit, for example, in inner quarter Atlanta communities, and understand how many of those routes of public transit were taken offline when the complexion of the people living in those spaces change, then you have a different kind of conversation that you're ready to have about what is possible in terms of connecting people using public transit, what in fact has already happened in the history of this space. At the Atlanta History Center, we're committed to leveraging our resources. We have resources in the museum, in our museum collections, but also in our archival collections, and also in our kind of knowledge base, right? So all of those resources need to be leveraged to create relationships that are collaborative, both in the spaces. So Atlanta History Center has a big campus in Buckhead and a smaller campus in Midtown. So in those spaces, but also external to those spaces. If our mission is to interpret historical subjects pertaining to Atlanta, then we haven't said anything about interpreting those subjects for people who can pay $21.50 and come into the museum space, right? So that work might look like work that happens online in a digital space. That work might look like work that is outreach to school communities. That work might look like neighborhood-based interpretation that happens at community centers and happens in senior centers and happens in all of this. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing. And we can't just do those things by saying, we know your stories and we're going to show up and tell them. We have to engage together around what people are curious about, what people have an interpretation of, a knowledge base of on their own, and also how we can bring our knowledge base to bear and say, like, we're doing a partnership together with you based on what you're saying you're interested in, the assets that we have, the technologies. And when I say technologies, I don't mean digital necessarily, but the technologies in terms of know-how that we might bring to creating an exhibition or using, digital technology in order to create something. But when we leave you after this experience, you ought to be able to continue to do this work yourselves in whatever ways you deem appropriate with the Atlanta History Center or not with the Atlanta History Center. So our work is not by definition mission-based around community engagement and inclusivity in the same ways as the other two brilliant presenters are. But what we are coming to understand more and more is that we cannot do this work well without deeply rooted community engagement. What you're seeing in the images on the screen that I have up right now are a community partnership meeting in the upper right, and then a community day that we actually hosted at the institution. I think this is one of the Martin Luther King Day events. But in the upper right, I want to point out to you that in this instance, as part of our neighborhood initiative, we were bringing people together as a matter of pragmatism, right? But working with each of those communities separately in interpreting the history of those neighborhoods and deciding how we were going to share that with community. One of the beautiful things that happened as a result of that engagement was that those people from different communities that didn't know each other then began to work and share ideas with one another. And so that's the kind of collateral that we're trying to produce. There should be a multiplier effect in the community engagement work that we do. For our community partnerships to be impactful and sustainable, we're not just looking for kind of cool projects. There's lots of cool projects to engage, but we're about what it means to engage a project that is going to be impactful in terms of making meaningful change. And even as a cultural institution, that's a critically important question. What are we doing that can be applied to the present in a way that will provide representation, will be empowering to the people with whom we're working in various community spaces, and for practical reasons, and in terms of having the most impact we can. We're also looking at relationships that can be sustainable. And so what we mean by that is, rather than just thinking kind of one event at a time, we need to build sustained relationships over time that can be empowering and solidarity building across institutions. This is really critically important. I think one of the panelists, perhaps it was Odetta, already said, this is largely about building trust, and trust relationships take time. So what we're looking for here is partnerships that have longevity and deep impact. Relationships where we can, for us, bring original scholarship and frame shifting opportunities, but thinking in a broader sense about what original scholarship means, like what kinds of knowledge is being held in communities with which we are working, with whom we are talking about serving, but also have to understand as communities with which we share authority. And where do we find shared and overlapping priorities that we can dig in around over a long haul? One of the things that's particularly challenging about that in this moment of COVID is that understanding that impact and understanding that sustainability is not a short game, right? So even as we're trying to be nimble, we have to think about our core goals and really kind of dig in around that. So perhaps we're trying new techniques in terms of digital engagement. For us, we have launched a neighborhoods initiative, which began before this moment, where we were working with several neighborhoods in order to share their community stories. But one of the things that happened as a consequence of that work was that, sorry, lost myself there. One of the things that happened as a consequence of that work was that we realized that coming together is particularly powerful. So we were going to have a community dinner with elders this month in order to celebrate the culmination of some work that we were doing with Oakland City and Bush Mountain. Now, clearly that's a very bad idea in this moment of COVID. But we recognize that we didn't want to just take that online. You know, a priority audience and partner in this was the older community of people who are particularly vulnerable at this moment in time. And they're not necessarily always people who want to engage digitally. And so we had to begin to shift our thinking about what it is that people need. It's not just the game of the knowledge building or the information sharing or even sometimes the political empowerment. Sometimes it's also about creating connection, Sometimes it's also about approaching people in spaces of loneliness. Sometimes it's also about providing outlets for people's creativity when they're under-resourced in order to do those things. And so we're constantly kind of trying to engage in nimble ways around what that means. I'm just going to show you a couple of images here of some of that work. It can look like, again, really deeply rooted work that unfolds over a long period of time. It is not necessarily the case where we're counting heads. We're counting the number of people who show up at an event in order to determine how we're being successful, but rather whether it's meaningful and something that people can pick up later. And the images that you're seeing here, we worked pretty extensively with the Latinx community along a hub on Buford Highway with several organizations, several stakeholder organizations, thinking about what it would look like to tell the story of multinational immigration in Latinx community in Atlanta. And I walked into that with a very clear idea of what I wanted to do. Theater is going to be great. People are going to love it. We are ready to go. And one of the most powerful things that happened was I got it handed to me, and people were like, "You're not right. You're wrong. This is not what I want." And what they said was, "It's great that you do that work at the Atlanta History Center. Keep telling this story," which had to do with a museum theater piece about a traffic stop, really traumatic, and someone's immigration status being questioned and the implications potentially of that. And it's empathy building work. It's fantastic at the Buckhead Atlanta History Center. And they're like, "We don't want to be accosted by this story when we're going about our shopping at Plaza Fiesta, which is where we're going to do it. We know that story. The story we don't know is this story of a longer history, right? We talk a lot about this new immigration story, but a long history, a multinational history. There are silences that we're not talking across. We want a mural that represents the diversity of our community and the waves of immigration and the ways in which we are stakeholder populations here, because that is going to be empowering as we press forward and call for the kinds of representation and recognition and care that we demand as a community. So it's a beautiful thing, I think, to engage, to be willing to share authority about kind of what the end game of that work might be. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for more Q&A. So I'm going to end my talk portion right now, and the full PowerPoint will be available after the webinar for those who want to explore a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you, Kalinda. It's interesting because in this work of community engagement, especially with respect to the ARC, a lot of times, as you mentioned, it can be for community engagement means one component of a project. You know, it's part of a specific project or a specific plan for a master plan exercise for a community or a one transportation project. And I appreciated what you and Kalinda said, you and Odetta said about this being, you know, really about the long term and about building trust, particularly in communities where, you know, Odetta mentioned this, is that you go through a process of community engagement and you're supposed to deliver on what people asked for during that process or for what people stated that they wanted to see. And so often those have not been delivered, or the community engagement process was just something for us to check a box. So appreciated talking about the long term and about acknowledging power within a community and the stories belonging within that community. And so thank you so much for sharing that. I do have one question from the audience, from Lauren. Screen just moved. Screen's moving with questions. Kalinda, how do you get your leadership, I'm assuming at the Atlanta History Center, on board with sharing decision-making power with your partners?
Yeah, that's an important and it can be a tough question. I think that there are a couple of answers to that. One of the answers is something that I mentioned earlier on, which is to understand and advocate for the reality that we're not holding all of the information. We're not holding all of the power and the assets. I think that there's a way that particularly legacy organizations can feel like they're holding the power and that they then have the decision to power share or not. But in fact, to do good history about Atlanta, right? To really do that work in a credible and authentic way demands that we share authority because we don't have all of the information, right? Those organizations weren't collecting in that way, weren't building their knowledge base in that way. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is that, you know, I can't even tell you how often I talk about the demographics of this space. So folks can feel the way they want to feel. They can say what they want to say. They can do whatever rhetorical dances they want to do across this political landscape. The reality is that people who occupy the space look the ways that they look and come from the places that they come from. And if we are going to claim to be organizations that have validity in this space, then we need to be speaking to their concerns. We need to be them. They need to be us. Because otherwise what you're representing is something that is maybe in a best case scenario antiquated. It's certainly irrelevant.
Okay, so we do have lots of questions that came in during the course of all of your presentations. I really liked two that I'm going to ask all of you to answer. And the first question is from Nedra Deadweiler. Do you find that you are leading your community or your community leads you? And in what ways? And how can you speak to the nuance? And I'm going to go with Stephanie, then Odetta and Kalinda. And if you need me to repeat that, I can do that too.
Can you repeat it? It's how they lead.
Yes.
How they lead us and how we lead them.
Yes. Do you find that you are leading your community or is your community leading you? And I guess it would be both, but can you speak to the nuance?
Yes, it's both. I think it's most, thank you. I think it's mostly that they lead us. So a lot of the work we do is because it was a community need that we had heard. And so that's why we responded in that way. Mutual aid was specifically because we heard Laotian and Cambodian seniors needed specific items and it was hard for them to get them. So we did that. Around the interpreter case, we were doing poll monitoring in language at the polls in 2018, and there was a gentleman who couldn't get the interpreter of his choice, and so he was a Korean man, and we were able to bring that case for him. Before we started having coordinated immigration clinics, just naturalization kind of clinics, there wasn't a real coordinated effort with all the other groups, and now we have a coordinated effort. And it was also because people just needed the free clinics. And that started in 2016, which in other places, they've been doing free immigration clinics for years and years and years. So I think it's both. And when we hear of something that's happening, like on a policy level, like at the Capitol, anti-immigrant legislation being presented, then we tell the community what's happening, and then there's an obvious immediate response that can happen right afterwards. So that's the both.
I think I'm up next. So I think it's super important to define what community means in any situation. Transformation Alliance as a membership organization, I see community being one of my primary communities is my members, right? That's a community that I have to serve and support and take what they tell me and try to, interpret it in the ways that we've agreed. So we have things like a policy platform that we worked on together and took a consensus process to arrive at language. So if I use it later to represent that TFA supports something or doesn't support something, they've told me through that consensus process that they're okay with a certain language and a certain amount of detail and certain specific things we might do. So that community certainly tells me that I have to be a leader in interpreting and in sort of representing TFA's agreements out to the world. And again, because we're a community, a membership organization, we and I rely deeply on what a Stephanie would do. Like, that's somebody that's dealing directly with residents. I don't necessarily deal directly with residents. My members do often. And the times when I do touch a direct resident, boy, I get a whole nother set of information. So Kalinda, it really resonated with me when you said, you don't have all the information, right? I don't have all the information, and the multifaceted jewel that is any community is constantly showing you another side of itself, depending on who you talk to, and things you thought you knew about relationships turn out to be much more complicated. And you're trying to trust that somebody's repping the community to you, and then you talk to a resident and they're like, I don't, why did they say that? They don't rep me. So then you have to navigate and you get into your listening space, you listen with respect, you respond with respect, and then you have to come back and situate. My primary community is my membership, and we have agreed upon language. Here's the things that I think I can say and do that will not violate those things or that will support those things. That's why I'm tired a lot of the times, because you're sort of, and then your kid wants a snack.
Yeah, so I would say everything that they said. And I would add, so I think that to the extent that organizations and individuals within them are providing leadership, I think that some of that is about stepping to an engagement with a particular mission or goal in mind, right? If I come into your neighborhood and I'm like, let's talk about your history here and let's think about ways to amplify that and empower you. Well, that's not necessarily the first thing that's on your mind today as you're doing the 25 other things that you have to do. And so to that extent, there's a push, right? That is coming from us. And there are certain knowledge bases that we bring to the table to help as resources with regards to that. But I think that the other part of that question and answer is that the community is not a simple and single thing. It is only a thing when we're talking about the institution or the organization and the community. But once you get past that, the community is like as many things as there are people in the community. And so that leadership is very much about, the leadership from within the community is about kind of thinking about who's listening closely in the community with respect, who's reflecting with respect, who is connecting and interfacing with lots of different perspectives and needs from within that community, and how do you connect with that and follow that lead. But it's a very important thing. I think a lot of organizations get caught in this well-intentioned but ill-advised kind of direction where you say, I'm working with this community, and what you mean is that I met Marion, and so now I'm working with and she, I know her, and we're having this conversation and not recognizing that that's not enough. It's really complicated, and negotiating that space is difficult. But I also think that that's a value that you can add by showing up in this way, right? Especially if you're not a key stakeholder in that community, you can help to negotiate that space. You can help to facilitate dialogue in ways that might not have happened otherwise. So there's a benefit too.
Wow, those are such great answers. I'm glad this conversation is being recorded so I can go and watch it later. Before I get to my last question, I did want to address another question, which was part of the question was about strategies and tactics for including the visually and hearing impaired. And obviously I want to acknowledge that this would have been difficult to participate, although you can participate over your phone. And I'm hoping that will be a separate conversation for us, and maybe a future webinar to discuss that issue. This particular webinar was really for communities of color, vulnerable communities, immigrant communities. And so which leads me to my last question, and then it's a quick one. And it's a question from Kate Grace, and it's about how can you engage with, like, especially if you don't have an organization or an intermediary, how can you engage with maybe members in a community who aren't already affiliated with an institution or a part of an institution? And then if 30 seconds each. Do you have any thoughts on this? If anyone has any thoughts on that question, because I think that's a great question.
It is a great question. And I think what it requires is getting into your imagination a little bit about where people get together. So restaurants, right? The church basement, a community health worker network. What are some of the places that are not going to be church or school or institutions where you might find folks go where the trust is? And that seems very vague and difficult, but I think if you ask yourself that question first, then you start to think about, it could be a soul food cipher meeting on Sundays, right? Or it could be, people know who their internal leaders are, right? It could be that one pastor. It could, you just start somewhere, and with authenticity to yourself and, working on presenting properly, they will guide you into other spaces once some trust is built up.
I would say don't jump in with solutions. I think that a huge part of that is figuring out, being open to figuring out and hearing what it is that people are most concerned about. So especially if you're not an organization that has a clear, specific end goal, like transit and connection. If you're engaged around questions, for example, like what does empowerment mean for this community? Be quiet, show up and listen. That's a huge and super important way in, and then reframe or frame.
Stephanie, do you have anything?
Yeah, I would just say also nail salons are just nail salons. You get a lot.
Hairstyle, yes.
That is a very good place to get a lot of information.
Especially now that they're reopened, right?
I know, it's terrible.
Well, that's the end of our time. Thank you everyone for joining us today, especially our amazing presenters. Thank you. So everyone should receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. And don't forget to join us next week. The topic is federal funding for capital and planning projects to address economic impacts of COVID-19. I hope you all learned something that challenged you or surprised you, that you won't be able to stop thinking about, and how to apply to your work. On behalf of the ARC and our fabulous presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. See you next time. Thanks. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.